everyone. This week we're going to go ahead and discuss evolution. Of course, when we think of evolution and when we talk about evolution, we got to talk about Charles Darwin. This is a picture of Charles Darwin right here, and he wrote a book known as The Origin of Species, where he talked about how organisms evolve and adapt to their environment. Now, another actually contemporary naturalist known as Alfred Wallace had very similar ideas to Charles Darwin. And actually, when Charles Darwin started kind of noticing that, other people are starting to have similar ideas to me, that's what that's what pushed Charles Darwin to go ahead and publish his work, because he was very hesitant to publish his work. And if you're wondering, okay, like why was Charles Darwin super hesitant to come out and tell people, organisms, they adapt and they change? Because you have to keep in mind that long time ago, people believed that all the organisms on Earth were basically unchanging species. They cannot go through any adaptations and change over time. They just didn't believe that. And so, therefore, Darwin was very hesitant to go ahead and publish his work. And tell everyone the following two main points: that all life is connected by a common ancestor, and that the descendants usually are going to or have the ability to go ahead and actually adapt, okay, to the changing environments over the span of time. But when, as I said, when he started seeing that there are, others out there that are starting to kind of have similar, thoughts, like Alfred Wallace, this is what kind of pushed him to go ahead and publish his work so that he can get credit for it. So Darwin went ahead and he published his work in the book known as The Origin of Species, and he called his theory Descendant with Modifications. And he was explaining the idea that these descendants, they do accumulate adaptations, and they do go through some changes over time. Where did he collect his evidence, right? So that he can publish this work and again tell the whole world that organisms do adapt. He went ahead and he took, a voyage on the HMS Beagle ship for about 5 years, and he, as you guys can see, he traveled throughout the world, and the Galapagos Islands is super famous because this is where he collected information about the finch birds. And throughout his voyage, he would actually write down all of his observations, and he would sketch all the organisms that he saw, and then he kept kind of thinking of all of the organisms he saw, and he tried to see if there are any similarities and differences between them. And this is when he came up also, this is where he came up with the theory of natural selection, which we are going to discuss. These are the finch birds, okay, that he went ahead and he sketched while visiting the Galapagos Islands. And what he observed is that basically these finch birds right here, they are similar, okay, but there is something different about them. And he noticed that what's different about these finch birds are, their beaks. The size of their beaks is, it's different. And so this actually got him to think, okay, like, why is that? And so he found out that the size of the beak does differ in terms of, acquiring different food sources. So if there are small seeds, the finches that had smaller beaks, were the ones fetching for these small seeds, and they were like, at an advantage if there were plenty of small seeds, versus the birds that have large beaks. They were using those large beaks to go ahead and, crack open like hard, large shells. Okay. And so when he saw that, and he saw that, these different beaks can give an advantage or a disadvantage to the bird, um, again, like, after he collected not only information about the finch birds, but on so many other organisms, he came up with the theory of natural selection, which is survival of the fittest. Those that will have, these organisms that have the best fit characteristic, um, those are the ones that are going to go ahead and do very well in the environment. They're going to survive, they're going to mate more, and they're going to reproduce more. Now, many years after Charles Darwin, um, two scientists, Peter and Rosemary Grant, they actually traveled to the Galapagos Islands, and they lived there for so many years. And they were also interested in the finch birds, and so, for many years they would go out and they would go ahead and take a look at these birds and measure their beaks sizes, and they actually witnessed evolution happening. They actually provided the evidence that natural selection is happening in real time. And again, natural selection is survival of the fittest. Those that have a characteristic that will help them survive in that environment, they are the ones that are going to, survive, and therefore reproduce, and therefore pass on their genes to several generations. And so let's go ahead and actually take a look at their data. So right here, this is data that they've collected about the finch beak sizes in 1976. And this is the data that they collected in 1978, 2 years later. And what happened within those 2 years was a major event. Drought took place in 1977. And so what happened was, during the drought, the vegetation at the Galapagos Islands changed, where due to the drought and due to the vegetation changing, the seeds, okay, the trees and shrubs, etc., that were, that was growing during the drought was producing pretty large seeds. So let's go ahead and see if that, made a difference in the beak's sizes. So if you take a look right here in 1976, well, there was plenty of rain, so there wasn't any drought or anything, so there was plenty of rain. And you can see right here, this dotted line is showing you like the average, beak size. So you can see the birds that were doing very, very well in 1976 were the ones that had a beak size of around 9.5 millimeters. Okay. You can actually see that, the ones that had pretty large beak size, like 11, 10.5, etc. Well, they weren't doing that well. It's kind of like, these right here, with the size of like about 9.5 millimeters, they were the ones doing pretty well. Well, what happened was, a year later, a drought hit, and that caused the vegetation to change. And so when drought hit, the number of small seeds reduced, and the number of large seeds increased. So let's take a look right here, and you can see that in 1978, when there was still drought, and the large seeds now they were the ones in common. Notice how the birds that have large beaks like 10 millimeters, they were the ones doing pretty well compared to the ones that have smaller sized beaks. And do you guys see the shift? Right, so do you see how right here the average was like 9.5 and now the average was 10? What does that tell us? This tells us that, natural selection did take place. Those right here, those birds that had the larger sized beaks in the drought, season, they were the ones actually doing better compared to the ones that have, smaller sized beaks. And you can see you can see definitely that because of that environmental change, the birds that had the larger beaks, now they were the ones in favor. And so they were the ones now, able to survive more because, they had the means of collecting the large seeds because they have pretty large beaks. And unfortunately, for those that have smaller beaks, well, they weren't doing too well and they were dying because they could not open these, large, hard shell seeds. Versus, when there wasn't any drought, you can kind of see that um, those that had, you can see that the beak size was not even that large, right? And you can see that, birds that had like, a 9 millimeter or even less, right? 8, 8.5. I mean, they were still doing pretty well, right? They were still, doing pretty well. But right here, you can see the huge change, and you can see that after the drought, those with the larger beaks, they were the ones now doing way better compared to the ones that had smaller beaks. And so right there, you can see natural selection, this is basically proof of natural selection happening in real time. Well, let's take a look at evidence of evolution, and we're going to discuss homology. Homology is basically where you have similar uh, similar parts or like similar you can see right here parts of the body. If we think of bones, right, you can see that different species, okay, they do have similarities in their bones, okay, but yet the function is different, okay. So there's similar construction, as you can see, between the appendages of all of these different organisms. And you can see kind of like, if we compare the human to the dog, bird, whale, kind of see, it's pretty the same idea, right? Like two main bones right here, and then a few small ones, and then there are some bones down there. So it's basically very similar, right? Construction, okay, of these appendages right there, but yet the function is totally different. So these homologous structures right there, they're actually proof of a common ancestor. They do indicate that all of these organisms right there, they do share a common ancestor. And another, evidence of evolution, fossil records. And so the fossils basically do provide evidence. By the way, first of all, what are fossils? Fossils are those imprints that you see, on rocks, etc. And so these fossils, they do provide evidence that, organisms, in the past, they're not really the same as the organisms found today. So it does tell you that organisms do adapt, right, to their environment over time, and so you will see changes. And fossils also show us a progression, right, of the evolution. You can kind of see how much, these organisms have actually adapted over time. And scientists can, like, take a look at the fossils and they can determine the age, okay, of the fossils. And they can go ahead then and start, like, categorizing all of the organisms that they found to determine, when, like, the organisms, when different organisms lived together, and they can go ahead and figure out, their common ancestor. Another thing we take a look at is also molecular biology, which is, when we study DNA and the proteins, etc. So actually the relatedness of organisms is also reflected in the similarities of the DNA sequences that they share. And that's why we are able actually in the lab to go ahead and use rats and mice and, you know, um, chimpanzees to go ahead and do research on, because we humans do share, similar DNA sequences with these actually organisms, and that's why we go ahead and we do a lot of tests, using these animals in the lab. And the evidence of, like, a common ancestor for actually all life is actually reflected by how universal the DNA is as the genetic material. And also how the genetic code, when you go ahead and take a look at the genetic code you know, to think of like transcription and translation, right? When you go ahead and read the messenger RNA and the tRNA and figure out, the amino acids that are going to result, that is also pretty universal between all living organisms out there. And so again, this is gonna, evidence that, there is a common ancestor for all life out there. Now, when we think of, the term evolution, okay, now we said that organisms adapt, right? But when you come and say, do organisms evolve? If we're thinking, do they evolve by natural selection? That is incorrect. Evolution occurs within a population. So we say that the population evolved over time, not the organism evolved over time. And so, since evolution occurs within a population, let's go ahead and think of what is a population in the first place. So, population is basically a group of organisms. They are of the same species. So, for example, you have right here a population of squirrels. They are living in the same place at the same time, and they are able to interbreed with one another. That's what a population is. Now, when we think of the gene pool of the whole entire population, we are basically thinking of all of the genes that are carried by the organisms that are within that population, all of the genetic, basically, information. Now, of course, there are genetic variants. Not all the organisms within the population are going to look exactly the same. They're not going to be identical. And so that means that the genes that they are carrying, there are variations. And so we call these variations alleles. So an example, if we're taking a look at these squirrels right there, and we take a look at their fur color. Now, their fur color is determined by a gene. Now, take a look at their fur color. It's not the same, which tells you there are different alleles. And depending on which allele is being expressed, the phenotype, the physical characteristic of that color that's going to be shown is going to be different. So, based on this image right here, we can say that, okay, I can see that there's a dark allele. And if the squirrel is basically expressing that dark allele, they're going to show a dark fur color. And if they are expressing the light allele gene, then they're going to go ahead and express, the light and show that they have that light fur color. So if you're wondering though, what created alleles? Okay. Well, one of the main reasons why we actually have different characteristics out there. I mean, if you think of us humans, you know, um, think of how many different eye colors there are out there, hair color, etc. So that's because due to mutation. So mutation is basically like a random change to our DNA sequences, and due to those random changes, new alleles have been created. And that's where, again, the base sequence of the DNA, bases went ahead and got altered. And that basically changed that alteration taking place within our genetic sequence caused, you know, um, the changes, and that's how we have different alleles. So if this is the chromosome right here, the DNA chromosome carrying the different genes, and let's say a mutation took place and that gene right here, got altered, and now you have right here, now you have an altered gene. So for example, if this gene right here was the one responsible for determining your eye color, and this gene right here is going to express brown eyes. Now, due to the mutation that took place to this gene, some people have blue eyes. So it turns out that blue eyes is actually due to a mutation. So if you're wondering, okay, what causes these mutations? What causes, part of the DNA to actually get altered? Well, it could be totally random that when the cell is dividing and the DNA is going through DNA replication, something goes wrong and the DNA sequence goes ahead and gets changed. Or, I mean, there could be environmental factors playing a role. Getting exposed to radiation, getting exposed to certain chemicals. If you guys think about it, when people get exposed, for example, to a lot of UV rays, um, some individuals, right, if they get exposed to a lot of UV rays, they will end up with skin cancer. Skin cancer is actually due to a mutation. The UV rays penetrated the cells and started changing the DNA, causing the cells to become cancerous. You will hear of, certain chemicals, right? Getting exposed to certain chemicals. These chemicals are pretty harsh, and so if you get exposed to them, again, these chemicals can penetrate deep into your cells and start altering your DNA. So these are definitely some environmental factors that can definitely change someone's DNA. Now, mutations, by the way, they are totally random. We cannot predict ahead of time whether an individual is going to have a mutation or not. So I cannot predict, ahead of time that, within a few years you're going to have a mutation and this is what's going to happen. We have no idea, okay? And another thing is we cannot also predict the consequence of that mutation. So there is a misconception out there that when people think of a mutation, they always think of negative things, right? So a mutation, they always associated with, for example, like cancer. That's not all the time. Like that's not always the case. Yes, there are mutations that can cause cancer, and so they're definitely, those are definitely harmful mutation. But it turns out that there are actually mutations that you can get, and it would give you an advantage. And then there are mutations that are basically neutral, like it's not going to give you an advantage or a disadvantage. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few examples. So, example of a harmful mutation, for example, when someone develops sickle cell anemia. So that's a mutation that takes place to the hemoglobin protein within your red blood cells, and it causes the cells to look like sickle cells. They will look like crescents. Um, why is that bad? Because when your cells look like that, they're not going to transport oxygen efficiently. So this is how a normal red blood cell would look like. If the protein within the red blood cell called hemoglobin gets mutated, the red blood cell ends up looking like this, like crescents. Why is that bad? Those crescent cells right here don't transport oxygen very efficiently. And then another, bad thing they do, they clump up and they block your blood vessels. And so they prevent the blood from actually, flowing correctly. So this is a pretty harmful mutation. An example actually of a beneficial mutation, unbreakable bones. Yep, there is a mutation out there that can actually cause the bones to be extremely dense and extremely thick, and basically unbreakable. So you can think of it as a beneficial mutation. I mean, who wants to break a bone? So individuals that have these mutations, they will never break a bone in, like, ever. And this is actually like an x-ray. This is an x-ray of like a normal skull, okay guys? And this is right here an x-ray of someone who has that mutation. Notice how thick their skull is. Kind of look at that white color. So notice how thick their skull is, including actually even their vertebra. Okay, so right here, this is the vertebra. So like these are the vertebra that would make up your neck. Again, see how thick the vertebra for these individuals? So again, that's caused actually by a mutation. Now a neutral mutation, blue eyes. So it turns out that there are pigments in our eyes known as the melanin pigment, and that's the pigment that will determine our eye color. Now, a mutation to that melanin pigment, reducing the amount of melanin getting produced in the eyes, will actually lead to individuals having blue eyes. So that's a neutral mutation right there. So we say that everyone out there who has blue eyes, they share a common ancestor, the very first individual who had that mutation. Another, type of mutation, for example, bulkier muscles. So it turns out that there's a protein out there called myostatin. And this protein prevents your muscles from actually overgrowing and becoming way too large. So this protein like prevents that. So there is a mutation that can take place, to this myostatin protein right here, and it can actually cause your muscles to overgrow. Now, how you think about it, whether this is beneficial, harmful, or neutral, it's a debate. Some people are going to go like, oh, definitely, that's beneficial. And so take a look right here. You can see that, I mean, I can assure you, this buffalo right here did not go to the gym, right? But take a look at it. It's pretty buff, and that's because of that myostatin protein, mutation. And this is another, image right here. That dog seems like, looks like it worked out, in the gym for several hours. But again, that's because of that mutation. So, I mean, some people, and by the way, it does happen also in humans, but on a, very, very rare cases. It happens more like in dogs and, buffaloes compared to humans. So in terms of is like, would you want to have this mutation or not? Again, some people find it beneficial, some find it harmful. Now, let's talk about microevolution. So, microevolution is basically evolution happening on a small scale. And it's basically where you have a change in the genetic frequency, in the allelic frequency. We just talked about alleles, and we said that Alleles are basically the variations of, the genes that you have. So someone out there has the red hair allele, so they're redheaded. Some people have the blonde allele, so they're blonde. Some people have the brown hair allele, so they will express brown hair. So microevolution is basically change happening to the frequency of those alleles that are being expressed over time within a population. So let's say, for example, you guys have a population, okay, and let's say that's a population of beetles. And let's say that the beetle population that you have right here, there are two alleles that are expressed. Some beetles are green in color, so they're expressing the green allele, and let's say some beetles are brown in color. Okay, so let's say that 80% of the beetles are expressing that green allele, and you see them green in color. And let's say that 20% of the population, they are expressing the brown allele. Okay, and then let's say that you go ahead and you visit, the population a year later. Okay, so after a year, you come back to that same population and you go ahead and see, if you see any difference. So let's go ahead and kind of, see that. So after a year, you come and visit, let's say, the population, and you see that the green alleles dropped, okay? And you see that the brown allele has increased. So you can definitely see a change. You can see that within this population, change did take place. So you can see that this population right here did evolve. Notice how I'm not saying the organism evolved, it's the population, right? The population evolved over time. You can see that there is a change within that population. You can see that, for some reason, the brown alleles are now, increasing, and the green alleles expression are decreasing. Now, why is that change happening? We're going to go ahead and discuss why microevolution takes place. Okay, now we're going to discuss the causes of microevolution. So again, like why over time you might find a population changing and evolving over time. Why is that population evolving over time? Well, there could be several reasons for that. Number one, it could be natural selection is taking place. Genetic drift could be taking place. And under genetic drift, we're going to discuss two important things. We're going to discuss the bottleneck effect that could be happening. We're also going to discuss something called the founder effect. Another thing that could be causing microevolution is gene flow. And then lastly, sexual selection. So we're going to go ahead and discuss each one of these in detail. So let's start off with natural selection. So if we start off with natural selection, so natural selection is one of the reasons why microevolution can take place and why populations evolve over time. What is natural selection? Natural selection is basically survival of the fittest. Those organisms that have certain traits that can help them survive in the environment they are living in, those are the ones that are going to reproduce more and therefore have more offspring and pass on their genes, right, to more offspring. And therefore, their traits are going to be passed on to several, generations. And these offspring are going to inherit their traits. And basically, the trait is going to live on, okay? Compared to those individuals that don't have those traits that will help them survive in that environment. So the ones that don't have the traits that will help them survive in that environment, definitely these organisms, you're going to notice that they're going to die and they're not going to do well. Kind of like how we saw with the finch birds, right? So with the finch birds, we saw that when the environment changed, you know, when the drought hit, those birds that had the larger beaks were more fit to live in, you know, the environment that was now hit by the drought. And so they were the ones that were more fit, and therefore they were the ones doing better compared to the finch birds that had the smaller beaks. And so this is an example right here. Let's say that right here you have a population of beetles. And let's say this is the background, right? This is the environment they're living in. So it's a pretty dark background, okay? And we can see that there are three beetles, right? Like basically three alleles being expressed. The light allele, the very dark allele, and kind of like, you know, the gray medium allele. Now, if there's a prey, okay, within this population, sorry, if there's a predator, okay, there's a predator within this population. Now, which of these alleles do you think the predator is going to have an easy time spotting? Well, the predator is going to have an easy time spotting the light beetles. Why? Because they stand out, right? They stand out against that dark background, which tells you that which beetles right here are the least fit. The ones that are least fit are the ones that are pretty light in color. Why are they the least fit? Because they're not blending very well with their environment. They are, you know, easily targeted by the predator. Now, if the predator, you know, every day comes and goes ahead and eats, you know, those light beetles, what's going to happen over time? Well, over time, are you going to see a difference? Yes. Over time, you're going to see less beetles expressing the light allele. Why? Because natural selection took place. Because the beetles that are being, you know, that are more fit to live in this environment are the ones with the darker alleles. And so therefore you're going to notice that these darker alleles are going to be more favored to, you know, to mate. Okay, why? Well, because they are the ones carrying, you know, the good alleles. And so they are the ones that are going to go ahead and mate more and pass on their dark allele, you know, their dark allele to their offspring. And what's going to happen to the light alleles? Well, I mean, they're being eaten, and so over time, the light allele might actually completely disappear. Okay. Now, can we say though that natural selection, okay, produces perfect organisms? So can I say these beetles right here, because they are now the more fit, right? Can I say those beetles are now perfect? No, we can't say that. Why? Well, because the environment can change. And if the environment changes, let's say, you know, this environment right here changes, and instead of that dark background, now the environment is pretty light in color. Okay? And so now the beetles that are going to, you know, that were fit, okay, when the environment was dark, guess what? If the environment is now lighter in color, those beetles are not going to be the best fit anymore. And they are the ones that are going to be now easily targeted by the predator. So do you see how natural selection can never ever produce perfect organisms? Because, uh, you know, one simple thing that can happen is the environment can change, and that's it. That trait that was once good to have, now it's actually not good to have anymore. Now, for natural selection to occur, right? I mean, there has to be, first of all, variation in the population. There has to be different alleles. And then another thing is those alleles gotta be inherited. Those alleles have to be inherited, otherwise, you know, how's it going to pass on, you know, to the offspring? And at the end, you know, those that have the trait that will help them live in this environment, they are the ones that are going to produce more offspring and pass on their genes. And this is just another quick example. If you have, you know, population of rabbits and there are three alleles, okay, being expressed in terms of like the speed. So this rabbit right here is carrying the allele that would make it run super fast right here, like medium speed right here, pretty slow. And let's say that, again, this gene, they are able to pass it on to their offspring, right? So it's a heritable trait. But let's say there is a predator, and this predator is, is pretty fast. So the ones that are not going to do pretty well are the ones that have the slow alleles and medium alleles, because the predator is going to go ahead and catch up to them and eat them. And so over time, if you take a look at this population of rabbits, over time, you're going to see an increase in the number of rabbits that are having the, the speedy allele, and you're going to see a decrease in the, within the rabbits that have the slow alleles. So one more time, you guys, when we think of, evolution by natural selection, survival of the fittest, do not think of the individuals evolving. It's the whole population, right? So it's the population evolving over time, kind of like how we saw, when you come and visit that same population and you take a look at the whole entire population, you see a change, right? So not an individual evolution, but like a population, right? The population is evolving over time. And natural selection basically is just going to either, amplify or basically diminish the heritable traits, right? So as we saw, with the population of beetles, when they were living in that dark environment, which allele was amplified? The dark allele. Okay, with the population of rabbits, which allele was amplified? The speedy allele. Okay, which allele was diminished? Those rabbits that were carrying the slow allele. Okay, so again, natural selection is either going to amplify or diminish the traits that are already there, right? Not a new trait, right? The traits that are already carried by these organisms, okay? And then another thing is evolution is not goal-oriented. So an organism can't go like, well, you know what, I need to change, like, and I need to change now, and I need to have this allele, and I need to express it right now. It doesn't work that way, okay? So organisms cannot just put a goal and say like, okay, I want to reach this goal, and I therefore need to, evolve now to reach that goal. It doesn't work that way. And as I said, you are not going to ever have perfect adapted organisms, because the environment, for example, can change, and these organisms that were fit before are not going to be anymore, okay? And so one more time right here, this kind of goes back, you guys, to the finch example. So we're back to the finch birds, and we said how, the scientists, right, that went to the Galapagos Islands, and they did see natural selection occurring, so they found that during the drought season, the finches that were doing better and they were more fit were the ones that had the larger beaks. But they found that when the drought kind of, when the rain started falling down, okay, and the drought ended, they found that the birds with the smaller beaks were the ones, favored. And they actually saw that, they were there for several years. And as you guys can see, like, from 1976 all the way to 1984. So they spent, like, a lot of years at the Galapagos Islands, and they saw this happening every single time. So every single time the drought hits, the ones that were more favored are the ones with the large beaks. And then they found that during the rainy season, the ones that are more fit were the ones with the smaller beaks. So as you can see, as the environment changes, okay, the organism is not going to be fit all the time. Okay, so this kind of proves right there that you will never have a perfect fit organism all the time. Okay. And another thing also to kind of be aware of is mutation. Remember how we said mutation does, due to the mutation, some birds have the large beaks in the first place, and then some, birds have the small beaks. Now, mutation doesn't produce all possible alleles. It depends, like this organism genetically have to have the gene that would make them, have the large beaks. This bird right here, genetically, they have to be carrying the gene that would make them, have the small beaks, okay? And again, this organism can't go like, well, you know what? I want to make a whole total new allele. Let me just go ahead and cook up a new allele on my own. They can't. Okay, so new alleles cannot just be created like this. Now, also, if you think about it, when you think of agriculture pests and you keep hearing that these pests are becoming resistant to pesticides. Well, this is evolution happening right there. The population of pests are evolving and they are becoming resistant to these pesticides. Now, how is that possible? Well, you must have individuals within the population. So this is like a multiple choice question. So the answer, let's take a look at the choices together. So it's saying right here, some individuals within the population have to be resistant in the first place. That is correct, right? They have to have the resistant allele. They have to have the genetic information that would make them resistant to the pesticide in the first place. And then they have to be able to pass on that resistance to their offspring. And let's take a look at the third one. And then, of course, they are the ones that are going to have a higher survival rate. Those are, the ones with the resistance gene. So the answer for this question is actually all of the above. Okay. Now, if we take a look at this question right here, like let's say you guys have like, a population of mice, and so some of them are expressing the light allele, some of them are expressing the dark allele. Now, in this environment, which mouse is the better fit? Definitely the lighter one, right? So you will definitely have more, of that lighter allele being expressed. Why? Because it's blending pretty well. The predators are going to have a hard time seeing this mouse. Now let's say the environment changes and now the environment becomes darker. Is this light mouse that was the best fit before, is it going to be the best fit? Actually, no. Now it's going to be easily spotted. So are you going to see a change? Are you seeing microevolution happening? Yes, you are. Again, what is microevolution? Change happening to the population over time, and you are seeing a change in the expression of the alleles. Are you seeing a change in the expression of the alleles? Definitely. Notice the light allele expression is decreasing, and now which allele is going to be highly expressed? The brown allele. Why? Because now those mice are the ones that are going to be more fit, they're going to survive, and they're going to mate more and reproduce more. So take a look at the question and go ahead and answer it. So we talked about natural selection, okay, and how natural selection can cause a change, right, in the allelic frequency within the population over time. Now, what's the other one we're going to go ahead and discuss? We're going to go ahead and discuss genetic drift. And genetic drift, as I said, we're going to talk about the bottleneck effect, and then we're going to talk about the founder effect. So now let's go ahead and discuss genetic drift. Okay, genetic drift. Basically, genetic drift is due to some random events, okay? The population is going to change over time, okay? And you're going to see, again, the alleles frequency is changing over time. And the two types of genetic drift that we're going to talk about is the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. Let's start off with the bottleneck effect. So the bottleneck effect is saying that your population size is going to be severely reduced due to a natural catastrophe hitting, or due to overhunting. So let's say that you have a population, okay? So, I mean, this is represented by a bottle with a bunch of beads within it. So let's say those are, this is the population, okay? And let's say the different colored beads are representing the different alleles being expressed. Notice how in this original population, I have the purple allele being expressed, I have the green, and I have the orange, okay? Now let's say this population right here gets hit by a tsunami, okay? Now, is the tsunami going to differentiate? Is the tsunami going to go like, well, I'm going after the purple alleles, but I'm going to keep the green alleles? No. When a natural disaster hits, whoever is in front of that natural disaster is going to be killed, right? So if a tsunami comes and hits a town, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of individuals are going to die and it's going to be random, right? When a volcano erupts, again, whoever's in the way of that volcano is going to be killed. And so let's say that this population, got hit by a horrible tsunami, and what happened is randomly, okay, some alleles survived and some didn't. And notice how now in the surviving population, if you compare that surviving population to the original, you can see definitely a change. You can see that, first of all, you've lost a whole entire allele. Okay, there is no more orange, you've lost it. And then notice how, again, you don't have that much of the green one. And this is totally random though. Okay, but the main thing that you can see right here is the surviving population is never going to be as diverse as the original. Okay, and so right here, did you see a change in the population over time? Yes. So is this microevolution taking place? Yes, it is. Now, this actually happened with with the bison. So we used to have like millions of bison, but what happened was they were hunted, and they were hunted like, viciously. And so we went from having millions of these bison to actually having just like about 1,000 or like 5,000 or so, like no more than that. And so do you guys see how much of genetic, therefore alleles and genetic information we've lost? And those genes, that's it, like they're gone forever. We can never, get them back. And so the problem is now, a lot of these surviving, bison, they're not as diverse as before, right? They will never be as diverse as the original population, okay? And now they are actually facing like, problems of like, becoming extinct because they are pretty similar. And so why is that bad? Well, because one disease can like wipe all of them out because of how similar now they are. Because if you think about it, you had a population of millions, okay? So one bison, can mate with, again, it has so many, mates that it can choose from, but you've went from millions to only like about, as I said, like a few thousand, not a whole lot of diversity, okay? And so again, due to the overhunting, the surviving bison population, now they're pretty similar, almost identical. And again, that's pretty dangerous because we could lose all the bison. And so again, true, like if you guys take a look at this question, will the surviving population ever, or will it have actually a lower genetic diversity compared to the original? That's a definite yes. Now, the other, thing we're going to talk about also under the genetic drift is founder effect. And the founder effect, that's when a small group of organisms leave the larger population and they decide to go and establish a new isolated population. So let's say right here you have a group of beetles and you can see there is diversity, and let's say a group of them okay, let's say the red ones decided, okay, I don't want, like, they don't want to live right here anymore. They don't want to live in this population. They want to go and make their own, you know, population. Okay, they want to start over and they want to go ahead and live on their own. Now, will this group ever be as diverse as the original? No. Okay, because again, it's just a group of, let's say beetles in this case that decided to do that move, and therefore they're not going to be as diverse. And so again, this, if you compare, right, the population, that new population, compare it to the original population, are you going to see a difference? Definitely you're going to see a difference. And again, this is one of the causes of microevolution. Over time, this new population, I mean, they're going to mate and everything, and they're going to express, their alleles, but again, they will never be as diverse as that original population. An example, like, the Amish community, they actually have a high percent of digit mutations, having 6 fingers instead of 5. Now, why is this mutation pretty common within the Amish community? Because if you think about it, again, it's a group of individuals that, kind of living enclosed, and so they do not mate with, people outside the community, and so therefore, this mutation, will have a higher chance of actually being presented within this community compared to outside. Now, does that mean, outside of the Amish community, there aren't any individuals outside of the Amish community that have this mutation? There is, definitely, okay? There are definitely, people outside that have 6 fingers. But why is it not as common? Because think about it, I mean, there are millions of millions of people, so the chances are of someone mating with, someone else who has 6 fingers, it's much, much lower. But if you have a population and a lot of them actually have that mutation, and again, it's a pretty small population, then the chances of that mutation being expressed is going to be at a much higher scale. So we've talked about natural selection, we've talked about genetic drift. What's another cause of microevolution that can cause the population to change over time? Gene flow. Okay, so let's go ahead and discuss gene flow together. Gene flow is basically the idea of genetic exchange, okay, amongst different populations. So let's say that there's a population of beetles, and this population of beetles are expressing the green allele. And let's say there's another population right here of brown, expressing the brown allele. If some of these beetles decide to migrate over to this side, okay, well, now this population is going to have what? It's going to have a new allele. And what could happen if those beetles are the same species, they're going to go ahead and breed. And now this population right here is going to gain a new allele. So over time, are you going to see a change? Yes, you are. You're going to see that this population, they're not only going to be expressing the green allele anymore, but you're going to see that they're also expressing the brown allele. Okay? And so basically, this is gene flow, where a population can either gain a new allele or they can lose a new allele if, again, some of them decide to move on to that other population. So what happens is, again, the populations over time will go ahead and express different alleles, And what you can see over time is those two populations. I mean, if you have some brown beetles migrating over here and then you have some green beetles moving on the other side, what you can see is over time, those two populations could actually be pretty similar because now they're both going to be expressing both the green and the brown alleles. Okay. Another cause of microevolution that can again cause the population to change over time and the allelic frequency to change over time is sexual selection. Sexual selection is basically when individuals with certain favored traits, they're going to be, more sought after as a mate, and so they are the ones that are going to reproduce more and pass on their traits. I did post a couple of videos for you to watch. Pretty interesting, okay, about sexual selection. So go ahead and take a look at them. Now, for example, if we take a look at peacocks, so this is a male peacock, and so during the mating season, the male peacock is going to go ahead and they're going to basically like show off, okay? They're going to show off their, perfectly symmetrical feathers. And what they're trying to show the female is kind of look at how, good I am because what the female looks for, is vibrant colors, okay, and perfect symmetry. Because that would tell the female that this male bird right here is doing really well. They are very good, at finding food because if they didn't have, if they were having a hard time finding food, then this male peacock right here wouldn't have time to take care of their feathers. So the female, wants to know whether they can find food and they can survive. And the proof would be that they have time, to spare to go ahead and take a look, to basically look after their feathers. So therefore, these will be the male peacocks that will be sought after as a mate, versus a male peacock whose feathers are all like broken and their colors are like they're faded. That would tell the female that okay, this male peacock is struggling, so they're not going to be favored. Um, and then sometimes, I mean, it has to come down to a competition. The males would go ahead and fight over, the female. And again, the female in this case would want, would rather mate with the stronger, okay, with the stronger male. So whoever wins the fight, okay, that would prove to the female that, okay, they are much stronger, more favorable traits. And so they are going to be again sought after. And so again, that sexual selection right there would cause a change in the population over time. You're going to see certain traits being more expressed than, over a period of time because of that sexual selection. So again, sexual selection can cause microevolution.